But our successes did not last long. Several times the division had to flee and suffered heavy losses. Often the parts taken from us were used to fill in the gaps, and nothing could be done about it. Our platoon, on the other hand, enjoyed a long-awaited period of relative calm. Life in general would have seemed like paradise, if not for the necessity to live in barracks. We were forced to do shapeshifting as rookies. We almost rebelled. The platoon occupied positions located 300 kilometers from the front line. The camp was spread on the banks of the Dniester, 50 kilometers from Lvov. In this place the river is narrow. When we arrived, the ice had just broken up. There were ice floes floating on the water everywhere, but in some places the ice was still standing, and under it the river was rumbling, ready to burst out. The view was beautiful pale blue sky, snow-covered mountain tops on the horizon. For 2 whole months we enjoyed the transition from the dark Ukrainian winter to the mild climate of eastern Galicia. The snowfalls were considerable, but the frost was small, and our barracks were heated. They were clean. However, because of the economy of fuel, the temperature was not raised above 10 degrees. We were in a large camp organized with Prussian energy. It consisted of 150 wooden buildings, arranged in strict order. Each had a sign with a number on it. Nearby, in the snowy woods, could be seen a brick building, once attached to the village next door. This was now the location of our command. It never occurred to anyone that Germany had exhausted its resources. After the chaos at the front, organization and the need to account for every step made us feel like wild animals caged. The camp was near a large field. On it, recruits were learning to manipulate weapons. They were mastering an art that makes such a grand impression in parades and is so useless in battle. But the recruits loved it. Gals and I felt as if we'd gone back a year and a half to Poland. It seemed as if 10 years had passed since then. Our fatigue did not escape the attention of the newcomers. They began to show their enthusiasm to show that now it was their turn to show us how to fight. Nothing. A few nights in the mud, wounds and field hospitals will take their edge. We've been through it ourselves. They'll soon learn that war isn't always as exciting as exploding grenades in training. The Führer was scraping together the last of his resources. He had to send the Polizei to the front. These elderly recruits had a hard time. The sight of a policeman crawling along the ground on his belly gave us such pleasure that we almost forgot about our hardships. The police officers could not teach their subordinates anything, so they gave this task to the Wehrmacht, and the Wehrmacht did their best. Young recruits had a hard time. They often fell into the hands of those who enjoyed emphasizing their superiority. And our lives were not so serene. We had to make a tedious journey before we reached the barracks. We walked 50 kilometers along the icy Russian roads, loaded into trucks, reached Mogilev. Here we loaded on trains and traveled in cars the rest of the way to the border with Bessarabia, then to Lvov, and from there we reached the camp by trucks. We were given 2 days to rest. During this time we had to put our uniforms and weapons in order. During the first inspection, the officers were dissatisfied with the state of our uniforms after all. We rubbed them with brushes and beat them out. But gymnasiers lost their original colour. Grey-green turned into greenish-yellow. There were holes and reddish-burned spots everywhere. Worn boots no longer glistened. Many had fallen off their heels. To the officers, such slovenliness seemed like a slap in the face to which it was impossible not to react. They got madly annoyed and began to pick on us. Nearby, new recruits, former school children and policemen dressed in new clothes, were marching. A cheerful song rattled in the frosty air. There's nothing in the world more beautiful than my Tyrol. But instead of the Alps, the Carpathian Mountains watched their forced cheerfulness. One of the officers stopped in front of a veteran enlisted man whose overcoat floors were dotted with holes. "Give your name and number," he shouted. "Frosch, mister." Officer, the veteran replied and gave his number. Frosh. Something stirred in my memory. Frosh, Frosh. Wait a minute. Isn't that the guy with the goofy look I remember from the Dnieper crossing? What else did the officer want with him? Frosh stood at attention about 10 meters away from me and looked into the distance, as required by the regulations. His face was hidden by a heavy steel helmet. The officer felt his superiority over this much-seen soldier, whose overcoat had wire instead of buttons. He buttoned his overcoat crookedly. This could not escape the officer's eyes. But then, contrary to custom, our lieutenant intervened. He reminded the officer what our unit had been through. However, Mr. Lieutenant, you had no shortage of buttons. The lieutenant didn't know what to say to that. And besides, Mr. Lieutenant Sergeant Frosh didn't even bother to button his overcoat properly. There was a long silence. The lieutenant cast a sympathetic glance at Frosh. But what could he do? An angry murmur ran through the company. Attention, the officer shouted. Dostated. Frosh received 20 days in the punishment cell and several brig. He stepped out of the ranks and stood in the place of those who had been punished. The inspection was over. Left. Forward march. Our companies went marching through the camp. And Frosh stood still. He became a symbol of injustice for us. He always got the brunt of it. After 10 days we were given new uniforms, but Frosh still wore rags. He didn't know how to hate. On his face was always written a silly grin and a desire to do favours. A veteran once remarked, "This Frosh is as meek as Diogenes. If he doesn't deserve to win, he should go to heaven for sure." Company forward. On the ground. On your feet. Forward march. Let's go. On the ground. On your feet. Facing me, the frozen icy ground scratched our hands and knees. But we had time to be under fire from Russian Katyusha, and any task made us laugh. We sprawled on the ground and, leaning on an elbow, lay and waited for what would happen next. This behavior caused a torrent of swearing. The whole company was punished. We were now to crawl all around the perimeter of the camp. Muffled swear words were heard. Instructional officers were exhausted trying to get us in order. Vesredau, who had been watching with disgust, started an argument with the officers in charge of the camp, but he could have saved his throat. An order had already come down from above, cancelling the silly drill for soldiers who had already been to the front lines. Now we were to march in solid lines, as in the 41st and 42nd, and fight the war to the end. The marches were long. We paraded through whole villages and shouted songs. This was done to impress the local population. We made an impression, but not the one the command hoped for. The boys welcomed us, and the girls smiled at us. But the routine didn't end. We even had to learn how to retreat by throwing backwards. That kind of thing always comes in handy in battle. Every fourth day from 5 to 10 p.m. was a day off. We flooded Nevatorichnaya and Shurechnaya, the two villages closest to the camp. The peasants often invited us into their houses and gave us a drink, and sometimes a meal. Many amused themselves with the girls, who were by no means shy. These few hours of freedom were enough to forget any trouble. The next day we went back to the drills, which we were already tired of. Even so, we obeyed the order. Perhaps there was no other way, we reasoned. We still believed that any order is not subject to question. What if this exercise could really help us win the war faster? Finally, we were issued new uniforms. Some of the uniforms were different from what we were used to. We were given blouses like the ones French soldiers wear now, pants with pleats that looked like a golf suit. But the new uniforms were issued mainly to new recruits. Great Germany, considered an elite division, kept the old uniforms. We were even given new boots, which further emphasized the privileged position of the division. But soon the joy of the new uniforms was replaced by disappointment. The quality was much worse than the old ones. The uniforms were made of shoddy material that resembled cardboard. The boots were made of stiff, low-grade leather. At the ankles it was breaking rather than coming together. The worst of all was the underwear. It was made of such fabric that you could feel it only in the places where it was sewn in half on the hem and seams. The new socks we needed were made of some synthetic material. "No, thank you very much," said Gals. "I like Russian socks better." The new socks were much longer than the old ones, but they were less warm. They were made of nylon, a material not many people had heard of at the time. We transferred a lot of Gauterlin from the warehouse to the new boots to make them look like soldiers. Still, it was much more pleasant to wear new clothes, even if they were synthetic, than the old rags. The change in uniforms also impressed the locals when they saw us. They thought that the Wehrmacht was on the mend. Gals, irresistible in his new uniform, once again fell in love with a pretty Polish girl. He couldn't help falling in love, and every time he was on vacation he went crazy with love. This time he pestered us with stories about how he was courting his polka. "Your slutty girl makes us sick," complained Lenson. "You could kiss her and run away. That's it." Lindbergh grinned. He remembered the last date they had gone on with Lenson, Piergam and Zolma. They had driven a polka, who was at least 40, into the barn, and she willingly gave in to their passion. They spent 4 hours with her. When we were still busy, Zolma happily told us, the husband came. He laughed with us and said, "Mum is too old for me. I'm glad she suited you." They had a drink with her husband. "Your polka is just a sew," resented Gals. "And you a herd of boars. No romance." His words were drowned in a burst of laughter. Pastor Pergam laughed with us, too, for what could he do, though he was growing apprehensive about our company's lovemaking. I did not particularly dare to be adventurous. I patted 2 girls on the ass, but that was all. I still loved Paula and wrote to her often. I wanted nothing so badly as a vacation. The sight of a naked body made me uncomfortable. I remembered what I'd seen on the battlefield corpses with their entrails sticking out. I preferred platonic love in letters. Paula was very special to me, not like the others, fragile, marvelous. She couldn't be gutted, at least. That's what I thought. There was another incident that gave my comrades a reason to laugh at me. We were vacationing in Shureknaya. The weather was fine, though a little frosty. We were in a cheerful mood. But we were hungry. We were now given such small portions in the canteen that we got up hungry from the table. Usually the peasants didn't mind selling us food in exchange for pieces of paper. They looked like fake banknotes. The money was given to us as an addition to the cards given to the occupation troops. Eggs were the easiest. In Sharechna we split up. Galsa and the Polish woman were left in Novotorochnaya. The village was in close proximity to the camp, and the soldiers had already emptied it of surplus food. We decided to walk an extra 5 kilometers to Shureknaya, also located on the Dniester, and walk around the neighborhood to try our luck at the farms, the location of which each soldier knew by heart. I walked along the road between 2 snow-covered hills. Even now this picture is still vivid in my memory. At the foot of the hill there was a frozen pond, where yellow ducks were walking, and could not understand what had happened to the water. I turned to the right. A few wooden buildings appeared in front of me. I was on my way to one of them when a woman dressed like a medieval peasant came out of the yard. We smiled at each other. She said something, but I didn't understand. "Guten Tag, Frau Bit," I asked. I didn't think she would understand if I spoke French. But she might know how to say eggs in German. "Ei bitte." She, without stopping smiling, came closer. The woman said something, but I did not understand both her words and her gestures. I only smiled back. She gestured for me to follow her, and I obeyed. We approached the barn. She began to climb the extension ladder, instructing me to hold on to it. I looked at the nimble mistress of the farm with all my eyes. When she saw this, she waved her hand for me to follow her. Overcoming my shyness, I began to climb up. The straw was full of chickens. Polka shooed them away and collected a few eggs. Grinning, she came up to me, holding the still warm eggs in her hands, and stuffed them into my pockets. Danke 246N, Danke she 246N, I babbled, stumbling toward the stairs. I made an attempt to retreat, but she clung to me and wouldn't let go. I had two choices: either to get away quickly, risking breaking my neck by falling down the stairs, or to counterattack and throw the enemy into the hay, which was everywhere in abundance. But I was thinking too slowly. The rural courtesan, who weighed about 10 pounds more than I did, rolled me over and began to unzip my pants. The eggs in my pockets turned to scrambled eggs, and my rifle flew off to the wall. If the Führer had seen me at that moment, I'm sure I would have been thrown out of the great Germany and sent to a punishment battalion. Youth prevailed. I managed to escape. I rushed down the stairs and gestured to the minx to get a brush, or, at the very least, a sponge. I must at least clean my pants. Otherwise the paramedic will give me such a scolding. Still smiling shyly, the lady led me into the house. We went down into the cellar and found ourselves in a dark room with a low ceiling and a tiny window. There were pigs grunting behind the partition. That's where the nauseating odor was coming from. Near the door, on a bench covered with a mattress, sat an old woman. She looked me over from head to foot and smiled. I doubt if she knew who the Germans were. There were children playing by the logs in the middle of the room. My seductress brought water in a wooden ladle. I was about to take up my pants when the polka pulled them down and with marvelous dexterity washed them instantly. I frowned, hiding my smile, for fear of arousing a new amorous impulse. In my opinion, Polish peasant women clearly lacked manhood. I said goodbye, putting my hand to my visor. The old woman kept smiling, her toothless mouth agape, and the young woman, rattling her utensils, took out an egg from somewhere and presented it to me as a souvenir. She took no money. I went away, showering her with thanks. I had already reached the gate when the door opened and a woman called out to me from the threshold. In her hand she held a rifle, my rifle, which I had put by the table and forgotten. What a humiliation! I brought 1,000 thanks again, knowing in my heart that for a long time the old woman and the young woman would remember what had happened in the evenings. I couldn't forgive myself. Wasn't I an asshole? Miraculously survived at Belgorod, was never wounded, and it turns out, all this only for the sake of having a Polish mother clinging to my pants. At the price of what self-sacrifice I managed to get one egg, I was not going to tell my comrades. Why didn't you say anything? Lenson later questioned me. We would have all gone there, and she would have given us a piglet, I guarantee it. Spring came unexpectedly. The situation on the Eastern Front was deteriorating, and we continued to train as if we were athletes preparing for a competition. Strangely enough, the amount of training was reduced. Often we were given as much as half a day's rest. We really needed them to go in search of food. Portions were cut even further. There was almost nothing left in the two nearest villages. We had to walk long distances to make up for the lack of calories, but such trips took all our strength. We even tried fishing in the Dniester. But we had no suitable equipment, and we did not know how to catch local fish. 3 times Captain Vesredo came with us, and with his ingenuity he threw explosives into the river. This produced results. From some of the ponds we extracted quite large fish. There was also an accident. 2 soldiers went looking for food and disappeared. Their buddies said they had gone into the mountains. 2 days passed and still no news of them, and no one in the villages knew about them. It became clear that it was the work of the partisans. We sent 2 detachments to look for them, and they ran into the partisans. 5 of our men were killed, but the missing were never found. The Red Army had already invaded Poland and was getting closer to our camp. Soon we would be in the battle zone. We tried to spend more time in the sun and waited for orders. Gals was getting more and more involved in love adventures every day. He spent all his free time with his girlfriend. He called her his fiancée. Often I went with him, but I never saw anyone. We had a good time. Gals never tired of saying that soon I would get a vacation and see Paula again. When I saw that they wanted privacy, I gave it to them. The war seemed to have forgotten we existed. But one morning the peaceful flow of life was interrupted. The love affairs came to an end. The camp was in a feverish flurry. Companies were packing up and preparing to leave. The engines roared. What's going on? We were surprised. Forward march. Hurry up, we're leaving. Before we knew it, we were loaded onto grey-blue trucks and headed north. The camp was set on fire. Clouds of smoke billowed into the spring air. What lay ahead? There was a lot of chatter in the trucks. What's going on? Why was the camp destroyed? Where is the front line? At about 10 o'clock, the convoy with the soldiers of Greater Germany stopped. The road was blocked by tree trunks. Several thousand buds dangled from the branches. The birds, unaware of our arrival, continued to sing and fly over the trucks. A liaison officer who arrived on a motorcycle relayed orders to the commanders sitting in the Volkswagen. Separate gunshots and the noise of airplanes were heard. Whistles were blown. Attention. The enemy aircraft is approaching us. The Russian planes didn't waste time. There were already 15 of them circling above us. The trucks were left standing on the road. The officers shouted at the drivers, who didn't know what to do. Finally, they realized what to do and drove the vehicles behind the berm. The bombing started. We watched the bombs fly and followed the explosions that were going off. From afar, the bombs looked like thick arrows. The airplanes split into two groups. The second group dropped bombs after the first group had bombed. One truck flew into the air, and its wreckage rained down on us. Flames erupted and we crawled away, then got up and rushed with all our legs to escape from the road, which was shelled from artillery and machine guns. The second raid caught up with the fleeing men. Now everyone scattered, resembling marionettes whose strings had been torn off. The planes turned and flew away. 18 of ours they burned. The attack began so quickly that we did not even have time to realize what was happening. When we returned to the crash site, we could not stop looking at the sky the enemy could pretend to leave, but in fact lurked and waited for an opportunity to attack again. On the road, muddy from the spring rains, lay the rubble of mangled cars and corpses. Their entrails had been blown 7 or 8 meters away. But 15 minutes ago birds were singing over the road. In just 15 minutes our column, which consisted of 30 trucks with 3 companies, lost 20 soldiers and 18 trucks. There were 3 more wounded in serious condition. We collected the remains of the dead and buried them. Among the dead were Goth and Dundee, both of whom had received the cross for bravery on the second front on the Dnieper. They were our friends. Until 24 hours ago we were laughing together. We piled into the remaining trucks, barely able to withstand such an overload. Soldiers were everywhere on the running boards, fenders, hoods and bumpers. The trucks were travelling at no more than 30 kilometers per hour, but still 2 of them broke down. Those in them had to walk the rest of the way. They joined us 6 hours later at the Romanian border. We were preparing for a bloodbath near Vinica, in the gap between the Central Front, where the breakthrough had occurred, and the Southern Front, which was still holding out. On the way, our soldiers were attacked by partisans Russians and Poles, but fortunately they managed to destroy them. The soldiers took the horses from the partisans, took and those that remained in neighbouring villages. The weather was warm and sunny. We were returning to Russia again, having taken from the Romanians several trucks intended for civilian needs. The cars were old, with company names painted on them, and we didn't have time to plaster them over. Our platoon was loaded into an English van, produced back in 1930 or so. we entered the land of Ukraine. It had not yet dried up after the snow melted, and we had to trudge over the sticky mud with great difficulty. But the weather was fine, and we marched stripped to the waist. On the way we received new orders. Now we were not to go to Vinica, but to restore the communication between the rear and the front, broken by the partisans. Their detachments were ordered to be destroyed. Indeed, partisan attacks paralyzed the already difficult supply of food and ammunition. The assembly point at Vinica was to be retained as a starting point for new offensives of the German army in order to eliminate the wedge by which the Russians had cut into Poland before Lvov, and to re-establish communication with the north, which was still standing. Our companies, together with other units, began to fight the partisans in the rear. Otherwise, we were a mobile unit. It was assumed that we would immediately come to the aid, where the threat was particularly great. However, our mobility depended on the vehicles, and I have already told you about them. Gradually we abandoned them and moved on horseback or on bicycles, the tires of which had to be filled with grass. We took horses and bicycles from thousands of refugees, Ukrainians, Roma, Polish settlers. Sometimes there were partisans among them, pretending to be peasants. But at some moments they would shoot German soldiers in the back, causing confusion. It was assumed that we would lose self-control and retaliate against the refugees, and those in turn would defect to our enemies. From the enemy's point of view, the end justified the means. By the end of May we had trapped a large partisan unit of 400 well-armed fighters in the forests. Even predatory animals are afraid of armed men. But those who fled from us could not even imagine that they had spawned an enemy whose courage equaled that which they showed. Our nerves were at breaking point. Despite the fact that many again seized apathy, it became clear who is a coward and who bravely saves his life. For us it was no longer a baptism of fire, but a common thing, though dangerous medals for heroism were awarded, as a rule, posthumously. We already drank our cup of horror and saw enough of the glassy eyes of those who received medals. And everyone knew about this side of life. We became fatalists and only laughed out loud. Those who were stronger convinced themselves we are all destined to die. So does it matter when? Those who were not so strong strove to delay the last minute before death and looked at the world with widened eyes, black as rifle muzzles. The rest, that is, most of them were covered in sweat from fear. It dripped down their synthetic shirts, ran down their legs and down their wounded arms. They were afraid. Their fear nullified any argument. Time seemed to stop for them. That fear went away as soon as we came face to face with the enemy. The first shots raised the curtain. The drama began, consuming all the senses. The first ones fall, and the tension falls with them. Everything loses its meaning. You can only hear the branches crunching underfoot. Our commander, Feldfebel Szperlowski, points out the signs by which we can determine that a large detachment has passed here. Numerous traces of extinguished fires indicate that we are approaching a large partisan camp. How not to run into mines? We have to watch every step and look around properly. The low bushes could well hide explosive wires. Every meter had to be passed with caution. Low, at the level of the treetops, an airplane passed by. We froze with fear. Suddenly the bombing would start. Finally, a short whistle sounded, and we fell down on our backs. At the end of the path stood a structure made of logs, a real fortress. A fight ensued. Szperlowski ordered Ballers and Prince to throw grenades at the fortress. Prince was one of Lenson's anti-aircraft soldiers, but there was no need for him today, so Prince carried the explosives. Ballers in general resembled a dead man. He was climbing on the other side of the road. We watched them in silence. Who were Ballers and Prince? Two soldiers who came from nowhere? Are they good or bad? Are they full of hate? Does God love them, or is he on the side of their enemies? They are just two people. They, as crazy as we are, have become our friends. Under normal circumstances, not in war, we would hardly want to be friends with them. But here their every move had a lot to do with it. Our hearts beat harder. 2 unknown soldiers, one of us became more important to each of us than our closest relatives. It was as if we had become them. Turn it any other way, and they would have been watching over one of us, no matter what we wished for them, as long as they stayed alive. They've gone quite a distance now. Maybe they're getting closer to death. It's just the leaves hiding it from us. I could still see them. Suddenly the prince straightened up and threw his burden at the fortress, then threw himself to the ground. The explosion shook the whole forest. There was a long echo. Birds flew up and flapped their wings in fright. The prince didn't make it. There was a crater, on top of which lay 7 or 8 meters of planks of guerrilla shelter. "Shit," said the field fable through his teeth. "There's no one there," said someone. Now I saw Ballers. He ran, then threw the explosives to and froze. A flash went off among the trees. It was as if the forest groaned with shock. No birds flew now. Ballers stood up, as did the prince, who was a little farther away. Their figures stood out against the broken ground. Behind them there was nothing. The guerrillas' fortress had vanished from the face of the earth. "This way, friends," shouted Ballers, rejoicing at the feat accomplished. "There is no one here." We ran to him. Ballers laughed nervously. From the bushes came a whistling sound, then another and another. The prince ran toward us, and Ballers threw himself to the ground. The guerrillas fought like lions in the ring. We were gradually tightening around them. 3 companies, that is, 500 or 600 soldiers, were fighting an experienced enemy. The partisans had so skillfully organized their position that to approach it was tantamount to death. 2 of our men ran into mines. Their bodies flew up to the branches of trees on which leaves were already blossoming. We were bombarded relentlessly by 4-barrel machine guns. We tried to dig trenches, but there were only roots in the ground, and instead of an attacking position we got a defensive one, which could not withstand the enemy's breakthrough. Only anti-aircraft guns, which fired almost vertically, could reach the enemy position. Unfortunately, the partisans withstood our shelling. They had 2 or 3 howitzers, probably captured from the Germans. The shells were ripping out trees from the roots. It was difficult to determine where they were firing from, and therefore it was impossible to destroy the guns. 10 times we started the attack, and each time we returned to our positions, leaving the wounded behind. Later we learned that Belgorod did everything to send motorized and armored units to help us. But there were none close by, so we had to make do with our own forces. To help the front was sent everything without reserve. An hour of waiting and intensified attacks passed. Our commander decided to take a risk. Leaving a dozen soldiers around the fortified partisan camp, he concentrated the rest against the enemy's weakest point, a wedge-shaped trench held by 40 partisans armed with rifles and a machine gun. At his order, 500 soldiers rushed at the enemy, using grenade launchers. Such a blow made the enemy tremble. 7 or 8 soldiers were killed in the offensive. But the excellent maneuver succeeded, and we did not regret the losses. I marched in the second line, followed by 2 more platoons. When we reached the enemy position, the partisans were finished. About 40 of them still tried to resist, but a shower of grenades had destroyed up to a third of them. The rest were killed by the bayonets of those who first reached the camp. We were on their heels. Another platoon was moving on the right. There were groans in the grass and bushes. It smelled of gunpowder, cinders, and blood. I saw the partisans jump out of the dugout and blindly shoot at ours, who had lost their senses from joy. Panic broke out. I, like all the others, began to shoot. A tall Russian shot at me 3 times but did not hit me. Then he rushed to me, shouting something and waving his rifle, pointing the handle in the air. 2 of our men came toward me and shot the Russian. He fell down, trying to reload his rifle, but we rushed to him and clubbed him with our rifle butts. Under the blows he died. And at the dugout a hand-to-hand fight ensued. In the midst of the battle, a mine or a grenade exploded, and both Germans and partisans flew into the air. But the fight continued. We heard shouts, groans, shots. In a minute we found ourselves in the center of the battle. One of those who fought next to me was torn off his arm by an exploded mine. Partisans and Germans, pressed against the log wall, fought with knives, picks, stones. An Oberleutnant hit a Russian in the face with a pickaxe. Kellermann fired at the partisans sheltering behind the 2 howitzers from which we had suffered so much. Many Russians, probably at least half of those who fought, managed to escape. Those who did not get away joined the dead. We picked up weapons and food, destroyed howitzers and buried 70 of our soldiers. Then we left, carrying the wounded on stretchers made of branches. In the evening we reached the camp and drank all the alcohol we could get, trying to douse the memory of the bloody day with vodka. It's spring in Ukraine. It gets dark at 11, but in a few hours it dawns. The weather is perfect, a warm breeze blows, which precedes the stifling summer heat. But though the weather awakened in us thoughts of peace, war, which had only temporarily been paralyzed by winter and the melting of the snows, loomed again on the horizon. The Russians dominated the pale blue sky. The power of their air force was immense. The Luftwaffe was limited only by the need to defend German cities and meet the growing needs of the Western Front. Our pilot sorties became tantamount to suicide. The enemy's advantage was too great. The few victories that we managed to win were the result of incredible heroism. The enemy dominated both in the sky and on the ground. In the rear fought equal the German army and the partisans. We were constantly sending small detachments. Every sortie ended in a clash. On every hill, in every house, there was either a mine or an ambush. We ran out of transportation, fuel, spare parts. There were no new supplies. Despite the air raids, the transports were getting through, but not to us, but to the front. And even there, having arrived at the front line, they could only miraculously reach the units for which the provisions were intended. Most of their supplies were consumed by hordes of starving soldiers retreating in front of the firing rampart. We got only a tenth of what we needed, and that at great risk. As before, we fed at the expense of the locals. But they had nothing without us. Our appearance did not excite anyone. The problem of food supply came to a head. Since spring had just begun, vegetables and fruits were not yet ripe, and hunting was more dangerous for us than for game. The remnants of our 3 companies took shelter in a hamlet. Between battles we slept almost naked on the ground. He who sleeps does not feel hunger. It was important for us that this proverb became a reality. With the approach of airplanes, everyone threw themselves into hiding, and when the aircraft hid, we again exposed our bony bodies to the sun. In a half-slumber we looked up at the sky and thought of nothing. And really, why? We had made a complete break with the past. Memories of peaceful life were to us the same as the books we had once read. In the war, we learned to appreciate the small pleasures of life. Today the sun took away our goulash, sausage and millet. There was no mail either. We lay on Ukrainian soil, calm and peaceful. Maybe tomorrow would bring groceries, or maybe gasoline and spare parts. Maybe even mail would come. A letter from Paula. Or maybe there would be only us, the earth, the sky and the sun. What's the use of thinking about it? One day Anser's signal went off in the transmitter. A post on the Romanian border was reporting that it was surrounded by partisans. According to the Wehrmacht, we, as already mentioned, remained part of the motorized units, which at any minute had to come to the rescue, and therefore must constantly move and be ready to quickly arrive at points located within a radius of up to 200 kilometers. The post that gave the distress signal was located at a distance of 160 kilometers. And we were called only because the officers were told that they could rely on us in case of need. In fact, we had only 4 trucks that could barely move, a civilian van, a motorcycle, and an all-terrain vehicle. Vesredau was tearing his hair out in anger. Without wasting time, we rushed to those who needed help. We brought as many assault rifles as we could. In each truck were 2 Spandau, ready for battle. Most of all, we were afraid of airplanes. With maximum speed, our detachment travelled along the disgusting Russian roads, raising splashes of mud. After driving about 50 kilometers, we came across a dilapidated village. The inhabitants rushed with all their legs to escape. We really had a beastly look. At the exit from the village, the first truck hit a dog, and the second truck hit a pig that had jumped out of nowhere. I was in the third truck and was able to enjoy the scene to the fullest. 5 or 6 infantrymen jumped off the truck. To end the pig's suffering, they bayoneted it. Streams of blood drenched the execution as they tied the pig's legs and hung its 80-kilogram carcass from the back of the truck. We set off again. We had to catch up with the others. Soon the pig was covered with mud, dust mixed with blood. But we didn't care. The survivors would have pork for dinner. Sieg Heil. We found ourselves in strange terrain. There were black hills with liquid vegetation all around. The ground seemed black and hard as stone. We drove for about 30 kilometers through this landscape. Just as we were leaving the area, the signal air came. Our soldiers spotted the planes through the treetops to the left. The trucks stopped on the side of the road. Here they were covered by trees. Vesredo looked at the sky with binoculars, but saw nothing. We have to wait a little longer. The infantryman from the third truck, not to waste time, cut open the pig carcass and got rid of the guts. We started the engines again. A few kilometers later, the planes did appear above us. There were no trees nearby. They descended and flew directly overhead. We were panic-stricken. But looking closely, everyone saw that it was a Messerschmitt 109F. But nobody thought of shouting hurrah to the Luftwaffe. We were too frightened. By 4 o'clock, we reached the combat area. Fearing a siege, we barely crawled. Vesredo's all-terrain vehicle was leading the squad. 2 scouts did not take their eyes off the dusty road and the mountains surrounding us. Suddenly, a valley opened before us. We stopped, turned off the engines, and immediately heard the crackle of machine guns. There was no doubt we were there. We could see a village in the distance. In a premonition of danger, my heart pounded in my chest again. Of course, the enemy knew of our approach. The driver of the first truck noticed how the commander's all-terrain vehicle at a dizzying speed flew out from behind the bend, but he barely had time to overcome the open space as a shell exploded on the road ahead. Everyone rushed to the ground, and the trucks went to the first shelter they could find. The second burst created a hole in the road. A cloud of dust rose. We were shelled with 37mm shells. Then the first truck was hit by a machine gun. But everyone, fortunately, had already gotten out from under fire. The terrain did not allow to distinguish the enemy. Those who rode on the all-terrain vehicle were just lucky. Only miraculously, hidden behind the trees, 37mm machine gun guerrillas did not open fire as soon as he noticed the rover. The road was blocked by a tree trunk. We set up 2 anti-aircraft guns and began firing at the enemy machine gun. It soon fell silent. We set up a whole dozen machine guns. As a result, the fire of the guerrillas firing from the side of the hills was suppressed. The soldiers, who had crept through the bushes, began to climb the hill. The mortar fire did not stop. We could not hit the enemy and acted only as a deterrent. We exposed to fire all possible centers of resistance. Finally, we found the partisans. Those bastards, whispered the prince to Smellens. They're just shooting for the fun of it. Well, we'll show them. Our company fired rocket-propelled grenades at the guerrillas. In the area between the hills, the grenades exploded with a terrible rumble. Then the enemy position poured machine gun fire. We recognized it by its sound. 2 more grenade throws were enough to force the guerrillas to flee. One of them was killed by a shot. That bastard, shouted the prince. It's sickening to shoot such assholes. You should have stayed home and waited for the war to end. If it were me, I wouldn't lift a finger. You too, sir, right? Comb. Yeah, sitting at home and waiting for the war to end. I nodded. Now we'll have to shoot them, said the prince. That's disgusting. Shouts came from the enemy's position. On the left, the silence of the spring day was interrupted by the rattle of machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. Suddenly, one of the Russians raised himself up to his waist and opened fire with a machine gun. He fired at random, but one of ours was wounded in the arm, and the second was hit in the calf by a ricocheted bullet. The machine gun killed the Russian. 2 partisans jumped out of the trench. The machine gun put them on the ground. Did you see that? Smellens asked the machine gunner. You hit a girl. A girl? You ain't lying? If they're going to have women in the fight. After a few minutes, we counted the dead guerrillas. 6 men about our age. Among them 2 beautiful girls covered with blood. The sight of them made us feel bad. They must have gotten in our way. We moved towards the village. The trucks followed us slowly. Perhaps the enemy had gotten the wrong information. Maybe the Russians overestimated our numbers. Or maybe they were afraid. It is unclear why they left an almost won position. The sun threw bright rays on the narrow, dusty road. At the beginning of the column, a skirmish broke out between our soldiers and the partisans who were holed up in the village cemetery. The cemetery was typically Russian blue, gold, white colors everywhere. Grenade launchers and light anti-aircraft guns tore up the cemetery. 2 detachments knocked out the partisans and occupied the area. The partisans took refuge in a hut where grain was stored. On the door, the enemy scrawled the slogan, "The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours." To finish off the last stronghold of resistance quickly, we loaded the machine gun with bursting incendiary bullets. After the first shot, the roof went up in flames. The partisans had only machine guns, but they did not waste bullets. From the shot of the anti-aircraft guns, the roof fell down. The guerrillas rushed to escape. Our 2 squads ran to the building to keep the Russians from leaving. By the ruins half lay a bearded old man. He put his hand on the shoulder of his shot comrade and shouted curses. He was not frightened by our rifles, but continued to threaten us with his fist. It didn't occur to anyone to shoot him. We moved 300 meters away. The old man was buried under the rubble. There were flashes in the sky. The first ranks of our squad were already marching through the streets of the village and shooting at anything that moved. The remnants of the guerrillas rushed toward the hills. At this point, they were without cover, and we managed to shoot at least 20 fighters. Especially many partisans were put down by the machine gun. At last, the firing stopped. The men from the besieged German post came out to us. Many were wounded, 12 soldiers were killed. We gave first aid to the wounded and drove the inhabitants out of the huts. Fires were burning everywhere. The villagers began to put them out. It took an hour. Then all of them, including us, gathered the dead in one place. Seeing their husbands, sons, lovers, the women screamed and cried. It seemed that most of the partisans lived in this village. Soon the sobs were replaced by curses. We silently gathered our dead and wounded. It was such a beautiful day. It was hard to believe that all this was really happening. Gals, who was dragging the wounded man, looked at the mountain landscape. The birds were still singing and flying merrily in the blue sky. We resembled winter-starved animals who are happy to enjoy the spring sunshine and the fact that we don't have to look for lodging. We perceived what had happened as an unfortunate misunderstanding, which only temporarily interrupted the peaceful joy of nature. The inhabitants were still weeping with despair, and their profanity, the meaning of which we could not understand, annoyed us. A stone thrown by someone struck one of our wounded men in the face. 2 infantrymen jumped up, shaking their rifles. "Stop it, you pigs, or we'll put holes in you." But the swearing did not stop. It was especially striking to see the women's faces contorted with hatred as they shook their fists. Suddenly 6 Soviet airplanes appeared in the sky. The Russians cheered up and shouted, "Hurrah! Stalin!" They pointed at the airplanes. Hate was written on their faces. We also remembered our own dead, the tragic deaths of soldiers who stood along the line of retreat in winter. The faces of maimed soldiers lying under the dark winter sky. My mouth was dry. We watched the growing anger of the peasants who had paid too great a price for a battle that could have been avoided. If the order to fire had come, we would have obeyed without hesitation. I saw two of the men's automatic rifles shaking in their hands and their faces contorted with anger. But then the tall, slender figure of Vesredo appeared, white with anger. He stopped 5 meters from the Russians and looked at them, so that they immediately quieted down. During the long campaigns in Russia, Vesredo had learned Russian. He ordered the villagers to bury the dead with the same politeness he demanded of his soldiers. "The war," he said, "would soon be over for you. You must wait for that to happen and not interfere in anything." "I never imagined," said Vesredo, "that in war one would have to shoot unarmed men who went into battle in obedience to false propaganda." Here his voice took on a steely hue. He declared that further rioting would not be tolerated. "I intend," said Vesredo, "to return to camp in full force. If any of my soldiers are killed, you will all be responsible." Vesredo's speech had the effect of a bomb going off. There was complete order. The wounded were buried. There was enough gasoline in the village to return to our original positions. We returned to the road. The wounded were left at the German post. The next day they would be picked up by orderlies. 6 more were killed. They will forever remain in the soil of Ukraine. We cast a last look at the faces of the peasants disappearing in the clouds of smoke raised by the trucks. Joy was replaced by a somber mood. Only the side of a truck and the ridiculous bloody corpse of a pig covered with flies loomed ahead. We wanted the war to end and peace to come. We resembled the seriously ill in whom the coming of spring brings new hopes. But the war didn't stop. Peace was only a phantom, and there was always someone who lit the fire of war. Perhaps they had their reasons, and very good ones. One of the guerrillas, while we were climbing up the hill, ran across the road and, having spotted us, had 10 minutes to prepare a trap. He hid the mine in a pothole, of which there were many on the road. And then he probably hid in the distance to see what would happen. He probably saw a bright yellow flash, saw the all-terrain vehicle ahead of him blown to pieces. Smoke rose in rings toward the sky, where the sun was smiling. The soldiers pulled the wounded out of the mangled rover. The rest of us prepared for defense. We laid Vesredo and 5 others on an earthen hill. 2 were already dead. Another one had his leg blown off by shrapnel. Vesredo was all wounded, his body was broken. We did everything we could for him. The company considered him a friend. We managed to bring him back to consciousness. We've seen many deaths, but this one was unlike the others. Vesredo's face was not distorted by pain. He even managed to smile. We thought he would survive. In a weak voice, he turned to us. He urged us again to remain united, united in the face of all we would have to endure. He pointed to his pocket. Feldfebel Spelowski extracted from it an envelope, undoubtedly a letter to his relatives. After that, another minute passed. We watched our commander die. It was hard to tell from our faces what we were feeling, but the silence became heavy. The lives of 2 more who were riding in the rover were saved. We carefully loaded them onto the remaining vehicles. Lieutenant Vollers took command. He managed to decently organize the funeral of our commander. One by one we walked by his grave and saluted. We all felt as if we'd lost the man on whom the whole company depended. It was as if we had been abandoned. That same evening we returned to the lonely village where our comrades were already waiting for us. The news of the commander's death shocked everyone. We were all threatened with death, but that Vesredo would die seemed to us as incredible as the death of a parent can seem to small children. For any other death we were prepared. But no one could accept that our commander would suffer such a fate. The sentries were feeling particularly restless that night. Our 3 companies now seemed more vulnerable than ever. We waited for help and support, but our commander was silent forever. Who would be appointed as the new commander? On whom would our fate depend? With the first rays of sunshine, we managed to transmit messages to headquarters. Do 217 has arrived. We were ordered to go immediately to the front line to the north. The base was ordered to be destroyed along with the village. We can't leave the enemy the slightest opportunity to find shelter. But we had no fuel at our disposal. We had to set fire to the thatched roofs of the houses. Then our motorized company left on foot, loading ammunition on old trucks left at our disposal. They were protected by radio operators and motorcyclists. Every 10 to 15 miles they had to stop and wait for our approach. We would either arrive at the front all at once or not at all. The orders were absolutely idiotic. The officer who issued them had no idea of the condition of the moving units, supposedly ready for any danger. We did the best we could. The worst of all was the food supply. We had not received provisions for a long time, and only miraculously got them for ourselves. We hunted, ravaged nests, tried to chew plants that resembled lettuce. Sometimes they managed to catch an abandoned horse. But 500 soldiers need a lot of food, so every day we faced the same problem. We'd ask for help on the radio and we'd hear back. The train is on its way. It should reach you. The military mail also disappeared into infinity. We received no letters, no parcels, not the slightest bit of news. The sun was blazing hot. Our situation had become desperate. Last night we had eaten a pig that had been killed. The barrel of boiled water from under the meat disappeared too. We called it meat broth, though it barely smelled of meat. We set off for the front. Our eyes are like ravenous wolves. Our stomachs are empty, and our pots are empty too. No hope looms on the horizon. We were used to living in a half-starved state. Our stomachs have processed food that would drive a respectable bourgeois to his grave in a few days. Now that it was Lent, our senses were sharpened to the extreme. We were like animals searching the desert for something to attack. It would take 10 days of marching before the hungry gleam disappeared from our eyes. Then, though our stomachs were empty, we still hoped we would find food. Russia, after all, is not a desert. There are fertile fields all around us. Soon we will come across some village and have a good feast. Shpelovsky and Lenson looked at the map. Our neighborhood is full of villages, so we are not in danger of starving to death. But unfortunately, the map showed an area larger than the whole of France. There are several hundred kilometers between the 2 villages, and going off the road to get to the nearest village means a few more days of marching. Nothing to worry about. Lenson didn't like to admit defeat. The steppe is full of villages not marked on the map. There are also collective farms. We have orders to march north. It must be carried out without delay. But there was nothing to eat where we passed. We had already passed many kilometers, but all we could see were uncultivated fields. You could make a lot of money out of these fields if you started growing something here, said a farmer from near Hanover. Near every village there were huge wheat fields. But beyond them there were only lawns, mud and dense forest in pristine condition, areas the size of a French department. We are used to long distances, seeing them as potential battlefields. Those who return home from the war will have a hard time, because the horizon is just a stone's throw away. And we, who are used to fields stretching to the sky, will have to sit on a piece of land that belongs to someone. If it weren't for this war. We loved the endless expanse, and long after the war we remembered it with longing. If only we could find something to eat. After an 11-hour rest we resumed the march. Like pills, we swallowed the wheat ears we had prepared 2 days earlier. We still had some boiled millet, but that was for last resort. There was at least one advantage: the light meal did not make us sleepy. We sipped warm water from flasks. The streams were far away, and it seemed dangerous to drink water from the pond. You might catch malaria, typhoid, or something like that, cholera of some kind. To cheer up the mood, we sang a song. The words and melody were blown across the empty spaces by the warm summer wind, but we had already gotten used to not hearing the echo, as it was when we sang in cities where there were walls everywhere. We drink and drink wine. There's so much of it here, as much as water. We didn't have much choice. There was no wine, and water had to be drunk with caution. Company march. And we marched on, singing to ourselves. Gradually, dusk fell. The column stopped. The darkness hid our faces. It seemed as if we hadn't even passed anything, but we were already falling asleep. At dawn, we continued on our way. The mountains on the horizon did not come closer to us, although we had been walking for hours through the valley. The highest hills were as tall as a man. From time to time there were islands of trees which made me think of African oases. They were small. The wind blew red dust everywhere, as if we were walking on crumbled bricks. We had long ago spit on the marching order. We did not march in threes, but, as was the custom of the partisans, divided into compact detachments, in which one went forward only until the next was in line with him. All were falling off their feet from fatigue, and slowed their step. We stopped singing and chattering. There was only enough strength and breath to move one foot after another. But how much farther could we go? Our boots were covered with dust. The wind covered our uncombed hair with mud. It seemed we had not moved a kilometre. The rhythm of our steps became monotonous. Only from time to time someone's stomach rumbled with hunger. The hike was interrupted by an event that occurred after an 11-hour break. 2 airplanes appeared in the sky. We had spotted them earlier, but fortunately they were far away. The horizon was huge and the planes could be seen a mile away. Now they were both hovering right above us. By habit we spread out and prepared for defense. Once again it was time for someone to die. What kind of planes are these? Either light bombers or reconnaissance planes. But Russian, that's for sure. Both planes flew at an altitude of 450 meters. The roar of the engines echoed in our empty stomachs. We opened fire. The planes did not respond. They just circled above us. And we watched their maneuvers anxiously. They're sure to fire on us a second time. But on the second run, only a swarm of white butterflies appeared in the sky. The leaflets. As soon as the planes left, we picked up the leaflets. A soldier came up to me with a dozen. The Russians were totally freaked out. We started to read the communist appeals. The German soldiers. You have been betrayed. Surrender and we will spare you. You've lost the war anyway. To boost morale, the leaflets had lousy pictures. The captions said they were the ruins of German cities after a bombing raid, and there were pictures of smiling German prisoners of war. Under each one was a caption. Comrades. Our captivity has nothing to do with the lies we were made to believe. We were pleasantly surprised by the treatment of the camp officers. When we think how you, comrades, are hiding in the trenches just to save the capitalist world, we can give you only one piece of advice. Throw down your weapons. Perforet. And so on in the same spirit. One soldier became furious. Those bastards. I know for a fact that prisoners are shot. He tore the leaflet to shreds and threw it in the air. We resumed our journey. But the leaflets kept going around. The words war lost, betrayal, cities bombed resounded in our minds. Communist propaganda. That's what it was. It's enough to talk to that soldier who was tearing up leaflets. But everyone who's been on vacation has seen the bombing with their own eyes. And our shameful retreat? And the miserable existence we had to endure: no fuel, no cars, no food, almost nothing. Maybe the war really is lost. No, it's impossible. Here we are walking on a Russian field. But to whom does it belong, to us or to them? Maybe it will witness our slow death? No, what a thought. We're just having temporary difficulties right now. But they will soon pass. Tomorrow the supplies will arrive. Everything will once again serve a purpose. Let's shake our heads. Let's get the defeatist thoughts out of them. The sun is shining in the sky. Let's keep moving. We belted out one of the marching songs, deliberately shouting it at the top of our lungs. There are roses blooming in the garden. That's where Erica lives. There are thousands of roses, and Erica is among them. At the rest stop, gals brought me down from the clouds to the ground. Although we were quickly forgotten by the hunger, it was not pleasant to come out of a deep sleep. "Hey, wake up!" "I can hear the guns," he said. I listened, but nothing but the sounds of the night came to my ears. "Gals, leave me alone, for God's sake. Don't wake me. We're going again tomorrow, and I'm dead tired." I tell you, I'm not the only one who hears the cannons. Look around you, others are listening too. I listened to the silence again, but all I could hear was the rustling of the wind. "Maybe you're right. So what's next?" "It's not the first time. Go back to sleep. You'll feel better." "I can't sleep on an empty stomach. I feel sick. I should get something to eat." "So that's why you pushed me up." Schlesser, who was on guard duty, came up to us. "Hear that, boys? The guns are going off." "I can't get it into his head," said Gals. I wanted to sleep terribly, but I could not let my comrade's words pass my ears. "The Russians are planning a breakthrough. Just what we need." Schlesser was indignant. "Then we're all dead," said Gals in a hoarse voice. "Come on, we have enough strength to resist," said a soldier. "Enough strength. That's what you have in mind." Gals did not hide the mockery. "And who's going to fight, may I ask?" 800 soldiers, starving to death, and in addition almost no weapons. You must be joking." "I'm telling you, we're finished. We're not even strong enough to escape." The soldier talking to Gals was named Kellerman. He was exactly 20 years old, but he reasoned like an experienced man and easily grasped what was happening. And the reality was that there was really no way out. Anxiety was written on the soldier's face. Suddenly there was a rumble from afar. A hushed. It was heard again. We stared at each other. "Artillery," Schlesser said. The others were silent. The fatigue made me feel like I was split in two. I felt as if I were dreaming and real. I thought I was dreaming, and in my dream I heard the rumble of artillery. My comrades continued to discuss what was happening. I listened to them, but did not understand what they were saying. Fieldful Sperlovsky came up to us. He, too, had come to some conclusions. "It's still too far away," he said. "But we are approaching the front. In a day and a half we'll be on the front line." "And by car in an hour and a half," said Gals. Sperlovsky looked at him. "What, can't stand it? It's a pity, but we are no longer motorized units." "Yes, I do not mean that," growled Gals. "I meant the Russians. They have fuel, they have tanks. If they manage to make a breakthrough, in an hour they will be here." Sperlovsky, without saying a word, left. And what was the use of arguing with him, an officer of the great Germany? "It's time to go to bed," said Kellerman. "We can't think of anything better." "That's a good one, I couldn't help myself. We are like animals in a slaughterhouse, waiting for the butchers to come." "And what, we're going to die on an empty stomach?" roared Gals. Overcome with fear and hunger, we fell asleep again and slept until dawn. And it came at that hour which in civilized orderly life is called noon. We did not rise by whistle or bell, we had nothing of the kind with us. It was just that everybody suddenly began to move, and those who were still asleep woke up too. Any sound or movement, strangely enough, easily brought us out of deep forgetfulness. Usually the troops going to the front prefer to go out in advance at night or until it dawned. But the Wehrmacht officers were as stubborn as sheep. They raised us at a strictly fixed hour and led us in strict order to the field of glory. In the sunlight our uniforms looked grey. On the right and left went friends who had become family for 2 years, and I walked in step with them. Remembering the past, I can clearly see seemingly meaningless details: poorly tucked pants, belts hanging from the waist, helmets hanging from one strap. Even a single uniform had its own individuality. One did not look like another, even though it had been specially designed to turn a man into a soldier who completely merged with his comrades. That's how everyone else saw us, a solid grey mass. For us, the word comrade, which did not refer to anyone in particular, was an empty sound. Behind every form there was a personality. It's not just someone's back that's as grey as the rest. That's Schlesser's back. And over there on the right is Zollmer. A little closer, that's Lenzen. That's his helmet. His helmet, not like the others, though hundreds of thousands of them were made. There's Prince, Hals, Lindbergh, Kellerman, Frosch. I'd recognize Frosch in any crowd. Only we had the same feelings. We all felt fear, despair, and a passionate desire to survive. We spotted them 500 meters away. 3 or 4 cars stopped waiting for us. There are at least 10,000 of them here. In the Ukrainian steppes, 10,000 is nothing, and yet it's a lot. They were scurrying along our vehicles, as if they wanted to take revenge for being abandoned. They were looking for something to eat, some medicine. But when they saw the state we were in, they became completely despondent. These unfortunates, drawn from several regiments of infantry, were retreating after several days of fighting with a ruthless enemy. He was playing cat and mouse with them. If he wanted, he shot them. If he wanted, he pardoned them. They walked on foot, in rags. And the despair written on their faces is hard to put into words. This army had survived too many disasters. Now they were not fighting for a cause. Rather, they behaved like wolves afraid to starve to death. They no longer distinguished between friends and enemies. They would gladly shoot anyone for a piece of bread. A few days later, they proved it by slaughtering the population of 2 villages. But many of them still died of hunger before reaching the Romanian border. The meeting with the retreating troops shocked us, but they were equally astonished. "Where do you think you are going?" said the lanky lieutenant with a sneer. He was drowning in his uniform. It was too big for him. He was talking to our lieutenant, who had taken command after Wesrido's death. He pointed out the route on the map, named the units, their number, coordinates. The strangers listened, staggering like dry trees swaying in the wind. "Do you realize what you're talking about? What other parts? What sector? What hill? You're out of your mind. There's nothing left, do you hear me? Nothing. Just mass graves that the wind blows away." The tall, dark-haired officer had a National Socialist Party badge and a bunch of grenades hanging from his belt. "Is it really true?" shrieked our lieutenant. "I know it's not easy for you. You're hungry. That's why you're not thinking straight. It's a miracle we survived." The man approached the lieutenant menacingly. His eyes were so hateful that he looked as if he were ready to slit his interlocutor's throat. "Yes, I'm hungry," he growled. "Hungry in a way the saints would never dream of. I am hungry and sick and dying of fear. And I'm ready to avenge all mankind. I'll get rid of you first, Lieutenant. There were cases of cannibalism at Stalingrad. Now they'll happen again." "You're crazy. In the worst case, we'll eat grass and roots. Russia is behind us, and there's plenty of food here. For God's sake, come to your senses. Go on your way, and we'll cover you." His companion grinned. "You will cover us. We can be calm. Tell that to the people in front of you." They've been fighting for 5 months, lost most of their comrades. They're waiting for reinforcements, uniforms, medicine, food. God knows what else. 1,000 times they've hoped. You won't be able to explain anything to them, Lieutenant, and don't try. We put the ammunition we had carried on the trucks, the remnants of the former motorized division, into our packs, so we made room to put the seriously wounded. They went on the road first. Thus we became even less mobile than before as we marched across the endless Ukrainian steppe. We watched the trucks disappear in the distance, envying the wounded they might be saved. Then our motley troops continued their retreat, an empty, utterly meaningless march. We walked as if on a moving track and could not move from the place. How many hours, days and nights passed like that? I don't even remember. Our units split up. Some stayed where they were and fell asleep. They couldn't be moved by any order, any threat. The rest, those who were still strong or had enough food, kept moving. There were many cases of suicide. I remember 2 villages that were stripped to the ground. And there were many massacres. Soldiers were ready to slit anyone's throat for a goat's milk, a couple of potatoes or a handful of millet. Running wolves spare no one. But there were a few soldiers left in the wolf pack who hadn't quite lost their human form. Some died but saved canned milk for the young and weak. Others were beaten to death by their comrades, suspecting they were withholding food. As a rule, they were found to have nothing. But there were exceptions. One Austrian had his head bashed in. They found bits of vitaminized cookies at the bottom of his pack. He had probably taken them from the provision sacks of the commissariat, which had ceased to exist a few weeks before. What crumbs people died for a chance to eat something. When everything had been eaten, even the shoots in the vegetable gardens, 12,000 eyes stared at the village from which the frightened inhabitants had fled. Living corpses could be seen everywhere, clinging to the last threads that bound them to life. They were trying to remember the past to shed light on the future. Thus the retreating army stood until dusk. Then 3 or 4 Russian armored cars appeared. The Russians were already quite close. They fired machine guns at the crowd of soldiers, who did not even try to flee, turned around and were gone. Those who remained alive fled to the west, which unconsciously attracted them as north attracts the compass hand. The steppe swallowed them up. Only a few managed to reach the Romanian border. It was close by, but not everyone was accessible. I was one of the lucky ones. There were 9 of us, Hals and I, who were inseparable buddies, Spelowski, Frosch, Prinz, and another guy named Zimen Lis, who had been a clerk before the war. There turned out to be 3 other Hungarians with us, but we couldn't talk to them. Either they were volunteers, or they had enlisted under similar circumstances to mine. They looked at us with hatred, as if we were to blame for the failures of the Third Reich. But they kept close to us, because we were their last hope of returning to their homeland. Eventually a village appeared beyond the wide field. Even now, as if in a half-drunken dream, I can still see this area. At the top of the hill we could see the huts. We decided to go in and get some leftover food. Halfway there we were stopped by the noise of airplanes. 2 yaks came out for the prey. We were like animals. Everyone was fighting for survival and didn't care about the others. No one warned us of the danger. The Russian pilots spotted us and began to descend. No matter how we looked, to the Russian pilots the German soldier was still the enemy, and the enemy had to be gotten rid of. We, obeying instinct, threw ourselves into the thick grass. Bullets whistled over our heads. We, panting, jumped up and ran with all our legs, but machine gun bursts chained us to the ground again. Airplanes came twice more, sprinkling the ground with bullets, but each time they missed. Here we miraculously found a ditch, fell into it and lay low there. We could not see the airplanes from here, but we could hear the sound of them perfectly. On the edges of the gully there were shafts of uprooted earth. The planes made one more circle over us and departed. The pilots firmly believed that they had put an end to our torment. But we remained alive and wandered again in clouds of dust. At a farmhouse left by the inhabitants about 15 minutes before we arrived, we found a pot of artichokes, and refreshed, we kept on walking. 2 days later, after we had twice had to take potatoes from the Russians by force, we came upon an endless ribbon of troops retreating toward Romania and entered its ranks. Thus we visited Romania and became acquainted with its population. The Romanians were amazed at what had happened, the retreat of our army and the disintegration of the Wehrmacht. Civilian life was fraught with constant panic. Romanian partisans were active everywhere, soldiers were smashing stores for provisions, and prostitutes were appearing in the troops in such numbers that it seemed to be the entire female population of the country. In a day we did 20, 25, and even 30 kilometers, despite the fact that we could barely keep on our feet. We would take off our boots, put them on, and then take them off again. But the boils on our feet did not think to heal. My stomach rumbled with hunger. The terrain in front of us was quite romantic, but we became wolves and, except for food, did not think about anything. A tragic episode, a symbol of human madness, comes to my mind. We were in the mountains. We had just passed the town of Regin, then called Erlau. Grey with mud, sweaty, we managed to avoid enlisting in newly formed units of straggling soldiers. Our column split into small units. The soldiers pushed wagons in front of them with everything they needed. We requisitioned wagons and vehicles of all purposes. Even bicycles without tires were taken. In this mountainous terrain, enemy aviation did not bother us. But the mountains also served as a great refuge for the partisans. Between us and them more than once fights broke out, not for life, but for death. Along with others, our group was desperate to reach our homeland. All of us believed only in one thing: if we managed to survive, our homeland would receive us with tenderness and help us forget everything we had experienced. When we reached home, the war would already be over, and in the worst case, the army would be reorganized and the enemy would never enter the land of Germany itself. Yesterday we were infantrymen, soldiers in elite units, grenade launchers. We looked into the face of death 1,000 times. And for what? We strove to survive for the hope of continuing to live the old way. Every day we had to continue our journey with fighting, fleeing from the Russians who chased us on our heels. There were 12 men in our detachment, among them many old acquaintances: Schlesser, Frosch, Lieutenant Wohlers, Lenzen, Kellermann, and Gals and I, who felt like brothers. Gals had become quite thin, who would have thought it? He often walked beside me, and I felt safe, though his strength was also at an end. He was stripped to the waist, with a leather belt and a bundle of machine gun cartridges hanging from his chest. From the leather ammunition pouch hung a Russian trolley coat, saved for cold weather. The heavy helmet was attached to his head, so that all the lice in his dirty hair died from lack of light. Many have dropped their helmets, but Gals said it is the last thing that binds him to the German army. Despite all the trials, we must remain soldiers. I kept my helmet too, but I carried it on my belt. One of the soldiers called us to a ravine. At the bottom of it lay a stained truck with the inscription W.H. Lenzen was already running down the slope, but he was stopped. Watch out. It could be a trap. Lieutenant Wohlers started to descend with Lenzen. We moved farther away. The partisans had set a trap for us. In a few seconds our comrades would be blown to pieces. But from the bottom there was a scream. "My God, there's a whole warehouse here." Without thinking, we rushed to the manna of heaven. Look at this. Chocolate, cigarettes, sausage. Good God. And 3 bottles. "Shut up," Schlesser shouted. "You want everyone to run away." "It's a miracle no one discovered it before." "How many delicacies are here," said Frosch fondly. "We'll take as much as we can carry and share it on the way." We got on the road, loaded to the limit. There are thousands of soldiers walking around. We must carry everything. We were almost finished with this task when our sentries shouted. Tension. We disappeared into the bushes. We heard the rumble of a motorcycle. The motor had stopped. We rushed through the trees with our packs. We had already learned how to escape without anyone noticing us. We heard the shout of the officers. 2 of our comrades had been caught by either a military patrol or gendarmes. Caught with bottles under their arms, grumbled. "Vollers." "Let's get out of here," said Lindbergh, who had run up. "Someone's coming," Lenson whispered. "A military gendarme. I see a badge. Shit, let's get out of here." We scattered as if we were being chased by the Russians. After half a kilometre we stopped, hidden in the mountains. "Because of these bastards, I'm completely knocked off my feet," said Gals, panting. "If they keep chasing us, I'll hold them off." "You're crazy," said Lindbergh. "What are you?" "Shut up," replied Gals. "You're not going home anyway. The Ivans will shoot you before you know it. You'd better think about what will happen to Frosch and the other one. They've been caught." "It's time for refreshment," said Wallers. "I'm sick and tired of just giving orders, sweating and doing in my pants like a child out of fear. If we're going to be strung up for this anyway, at least we'll have something to eat." Looking like starving animals, we gulped down the contents of the cauldrons and the rest of the food. "We'd better finish it all," said Lenson, "in case we get caught. Then we'd be in trouble." "That's right, we'll eat it all. They won't know what's inside us." We ate until our stomachs hurt. As darkness fell, we returned to the road. Lenson was the first to emerge from the bushes. "Go on, it's clear." We walked about 300 or 400 meters. We passed the ravine again, which had brought down on us the manna of heaven. No one was in sight. We walked another 3 or 4 kilometers and then stretched out on the roadside. "I can't walk anymore," Schlesser said. "We're too hungry." "Let's sleep right here," someone suggested. "We can digest what we've eaten." At 2 a.m., we were awakened. "Get up," shouted the old field sergeant. "On the road, or the Russians will come to Berlin before you." We resumed the march. The detachment managed to get somewhere a few horse-drawn wagons, so our legs could rest. By dawn, we reached a town perched on the side of a mountain. Some splashed in the icy water, others slept stretched out on the ground. The soldiers were heading west to their homeland. They were hoping for a warm welcome and had no idea what state Germany was in. On our onward journey, we came across a majestic tree with its branches pointing straight up into the sky, and hanging from the branches were 2 cools on ropes. We came closer and saw 2 bleeding corpses. It was Frosch and his buddy. "Do not worry, Frosch," whispered Gals. "We've eaten everything." Lindbergh covered his face with his palms and sobbed. I barely managed to read the note pinned to Frosch's neck: "I am a thief and a traitor." A little farther away, 10 gendarmes stood by a motorcycle and a Volkswagen. We walked past, meeting their eyes. That September morning we found ourselves somewhere in southern Poland. The experience of the day before prevented us from reacting adequately to what was happening. We looked at everything with frozen eyes, as if we had been drugged. An officer was speaking in front of us, either with a speech or a report, but we heard nothing. We looked up at the sky to avoid thinking about the earth that sustained human life. Either an explosion or a field officer's whistle could have brought us out of lethargy. But at least a semblance of order was maintained in this sector. We, too, tried to regain at least a little of our former strength and morale. The Russians were advancing southward with such fierceness that Romanian territory was enemy territory as well. Soon we would be fighting in Hungary and reach Budapest. The officer continued to razzle-dazzle. He talked about a counter-offensive, the need to seize the initiative to regroup. He even mentioned the word victory, although it had long since lost all meaning for us. We had not accepted the inevitability of defeat, but we had already realized that it was impossible to win. We knew that we would be required to make every effort to defend ourselves, but we also understood that we would not be able to stop the enemy at the German border. Despite this, we were not going to surrender. Those who survived did not want to accept the facts. Then, although we were very determined, we were in no condition to fight. We needed some rest. General Friesner has re-established the southern front, the officer rumbled. Our regiments will be reformed and reinforced with significant reserves. The enemy must not go any further, and you will stop him. We were divided into platoons, companies and regiments, and loaded into cars. Gasoline was still available. Detachments Great Germany sent to the north, which we were quite surprised because the main parts of the division fought with Army Group Centre. Some companies had already fought with Army Group North. We reached the train, standing on a single track. It was covered by a pine forest. There was no station. We rode in a variety of cars. The platoon I was in was loaded on an open platform, exactly as I had already arrived from Poland to Russia. Today Russia was no longer to be feared. The Germans had long ago been driven out of it. We were heading north. We moved cautiously, fearing mined roads and bombing. We reached Lodz by train. We stayed there for 30 hours. The front line was close by. As in all border towns, Lodz was full of troops and was also regrouping. From the regimental list a quarter, then a third, and even half of the names were crossed off. All of them were killed or missing. In Lodz, there was a Greater Germany assembly point set up in a candy store. All the counters and goods were pulled out of there. On the door of the gatekeeper's room hung a sign with the image of a white helmet on a black background, the emblem of the regiment. Sentries stood on either side of the door. "Here we are," said Lenson. "Welcome back to the Great Germany." For an hour and a half we wandered around the city, from which all the civilians had left, to find this house. Lt. Vollers handed the officer a list of the soldiers with him. The list listed companies, regiments, and platoons. There were 200 of us. "This is the list of those who came with me, Mr. Captain." "Did you bring a horde of Russians, Lieutenant?" asked the captain, looking us over from head to toe. Many were dressed in Russian coats. "My fault, Mr. Captain. We don't have enough uniforms." "Yes," sighed the officer. "Let's hurry to the warehouse." He nodded toward the squat building. "Maybe you'll find something. Only one foot here, the other there." There were enough uniforms in the warehouse. A lot of people got almost everything they needed. While waiting, we looked at the newly mobilized. It was the Volkssturm, a battalion of new recruits. Yes, things went very badly if they take such people to fight. Some of the recruits were at least 65, but it was even stranger to see young men. To us, who had been through so much at the age of 18, 19, 20, the young reinforcements seemed to be young men, but not teenagers. Here, on the other hand, we were faced with real children. The oldest were 16 years old, but there were some who were clearly no more than 13. They were dressed in worn-out uniforms meant for men, and on their shoulders they carried rifles hardly larger than themselves. The scene was both comic and tragic. They had an anxious expression in their eyes, but they did not yet know where they had been thrown. Some were laughing, oblivious to the rigors of the discipline they had been taught for 3 weeks now. Some had satchels. Instead of textbooks, they contained food and clothes carefully stocked by their mothers. Some were selling candied sweets, the kind of candy that was on cards for those under 13. The old men walking beside them looked at them with uncomprehending eyes. What would become of them? Where would they be sent? The questions remained unanswered. Did the command expect to stop the Red Army with their help? Would total war swallow them up? Are the Germans heroes, or have they gone completely insane? Who will appreciate such self-sacrifice? We stood in silence and watched the recruits' childhood end, and we were powerless to help them. A few hours later we were brought to the assembly point in Medau. Here was a large part of our division which had separated from us in the south. Even our regiment was there. We saw the familiar faces of the officers and were surprised to see how powerful Great Germany was. Our mood improved because no one wanted to accept the inevitability of collapse. We had to look for the lesser evil, either bloody battles or captivity or simply the end. The gaps left in the division were now filled by young recruits. Among the old acquaintances, we were surprised to see Wiener, a veteran. He was no less surprised than we were to learn that we were still alive. "We can't part," he exclaimed. "When I left you at the second front on the Dnieper, the future seemed so bleak. I never thought I would see any of you again." "Many died," said Wohlers. "It can't be helped. War." We informed Wiener of the death of Vesredo and Frosch. And he gave us the names of others who were no longer with us. We asked Wiener if he knew anything about Germany, how the civilians lived there. We all had someone to worry about. We listened to him with bated breath. "I was in the hospital in Kenzie in Poland," he said. "I lost so much blood that for 2 days they couldn't do anything to me. I never thought I had so much life in me. It's so easy to take your last breath and fall down the hole." But it wasn't. For 10 days I moaned. The first 2 days were particularly bad. I got some kind of disease, and then they had a lot of trouble with me. But I'm here now, and I'm looking forward to another goddamn fight. Now I'm sick from the damp. It turns out I've got rheumatism. And that's incurable. You old joker. But you should have been given a vacation. "Yes, gals. I was in Germany. I've been to Frankfurt, not the one on the Main, but on the Oder. I could have gone deeper, but why? They put us in a girls' school. Only there were no girls there. They wouldn't let us eat. Well, at least they left us alone. By the way, have you noticed I'm missing an ear?" He had a sardonic grin on his face. When we looked, we saw that he had indeed lost his right ear. In that spot was a pink scar that looked like it was about to burst. But many were missing some body part. We didn't pay attention to such details anymore. "Yes," said the prince. "You look like a dead man from this side." The veteran smirked. "You're so used to talking to dead people that now you see them everywhere." "Enough talk," Zolma intervened. "Better tell me, how is it in Germany?" "Well, how to say?" There was silence. It lasted for ages. "How is life in Frankfurt?" Feldfebel Spalowski pushed us out of the way and squeezed in closer. Frankfurt was his hometown. His family was probably stationed there. The veteran lowered his head. He was immersed in memories. The school was on the east bank of the Oder, on a hill. From there you could see half the city. Everything was grey, the colour of dead trees. Here and there walls blackened by the fire. People lived like infantrymen in a trench. Spalowski's face twitched. His voice trembled. "And our fighters?" "Artillery. Isn't the air defence active?" "Yes, of course. But what's the use?" "Don't worry," Spalowski said, Wohlers. "Your family was evacuated long ago." "No," shouted Spalowski. "His wife wrote that she was taken for defence work, so she stayed in the city. She has no right to leave." Wiener understood how his words affected us. We were expecting good news. But he didn't care. "There is a war of all against all," he repeated like a robot. "No one and nothing will be spared. German soldiers must be ready for anything." Shocked, Spalowski stepped back. He staggered as if drunk. "German soldiers must be prepared for everything in this world. After all, we created it ourselves. We are only suited for this world. There's no place for us in any other world." Lenson stood frozen and listened with a stony expression. "Is it like that in all cities?" he asked. He must have been thinking of his own town. I wouldn't know. The veteran dismissed him. "In the war, you can't get away with anything." "You know how to lighten the mood." Gals did not hide his annoyance. "You wanted to hear the truth, not fairy tales." I felt like I was wading through fog and ruins. I knew I wouldn't survive another disappointment. Of course, my first thought was of Paula. But it had been so long since I had heard from her that I didn't know if I would be able to read her letter if the mail came. So much bad news was reaching me that I had lost the ability to feel it, just like a barrel filled to the brim with rainwater. Bring all the rivers in the world to it, it can't hold more water than it has. Here we are in the third winter of war. And the older ones, the fifth or even the sixth. And back on the road again. At night we drove without light, fearing Russian airplanes which occupied bases in Poland. They were especially active during the day. We passed through Prussia, Lithuania, Courland, where the remnants of several German divisions continued to fight. In the darkness and fog we could see streams of people making their way on foot. At first we took them for infantrymen, but soon realized that we were facing civilians. We could easily imagine their condition. We crossed the Prussian border. We reached the homeland of Lensen and Smelens. Lensen stood up and peered over the railroad car fence. The others were not too interested in the landscape. It wasn't much different from the Polish landscape, only there were more ponds, but everywhere else was just forest. I wish you were here at Christmas. Lensen sighed and smiled. Now it is impossible to appreciate the beauty of this place. But the beauty didn't interest us too much. Lensen spoke again. "Wake up, you're in Germany," he exclaimed. "Think how long you have waited for this moment." In East Germany, Wiener remarked. "Almost at the front. I don't know if you realize where we're going. I have a compass. We're heading northeast, and that's not good enough." Lensen even blushed with rage. "You suckers. That's the kind of defeatists we suffer from. Underneath it all, you've already lost the war. You're just forced to fight, so you fight." "Shut up," there were 5 or 6 voices. "If they want us to win the war, they can treat us like normal soldiers. All you guys can do is cry. I don't see anything else. From Voronezh on, the war was already lost for you." "Why isn't it?" Gals asked. "You still have to fight, I tell you that. You have no choice. There is no way out." The veteran stood up. "Yes, Lensen, we will go into battle. We, like you, cannot bear defeat. We really have no choice. I certainly don't. I've become part of this machine, and I can't do otherwise. I've been fighting for too long." We looked at Wiener in surprise. We thought he was used to everything. And now he says it's worth living for something that has cost him so much. Lensen didn't stop. And we thought about the future the veteran had pictured for us. For me, a Frenchman, Prussia seemed so far away, so unnecessary. But Wiener also spoke of what I had fought for. Despite everything, I felt in solidarity with him. The fighting was getting bloodier and bloodier, and in such circumstances we had to unite. I was part of the regiment and thought without much pity about the possibility of my death. Death would end the fears of the past, present and future that overpowered me. There was a sort of fog in my mind, no, not joy, but a sense that I had finally come to realize my destiny. I wonder if this is what my comrades think. I don't know. But everyone seemed to be experiencing something similar. For several hours we travelled at a slow speed. Finally the train stopped. It was a misty grey morning. We walked to the wooden structures, the sight of which reminded us of the recently lost shelves. We were given an hour of rest, a cup of hot water with soy grains. Think about it. Somebody volunteered for the army, hoping to be fed for free, said a soldier. "You can't find volunteers now," said another. "Now many people don't even dream of becoming an officer. They know that they won't even have time to get the epaulettes of a lieutenant. A bullet will catch them before they do." However, the bullet didn't catch someone. A major, probably the camp commander, spoke before us. "Soldiers of the Greater Germany Division. Your arrival at your positions overwhelms us with joy. We know how bravely you fight, and we are counting on you. The same feelings are felt by your comrades in arms who are fighting now in the Polish forests near our borders. Your arrival gives us new strength. We have before us the most difficult task, the defense of German and European freedom from the Bolsheviks. They want to take it away from us, and for this purpose they are ready to use the most extreme means. Today, more than ever before, we must act as one man. With your help, we will be able to withstand the Russian horde. Consider yourselves the pioneers of the European Revolution. Be proud that it is you who have been chosen for this most difficult task. I send you the congratulations of the Führer and the High Command. Transportation and food have been provided especially for you. I know that as long as a single German soldier is alive, no Bolshevik will be able to set foot on German soil. Heil Hitler. Bitte Sie. We silently looked at the elegant officer. This is what it turns out to be. We are so needed. Heil Hitler. Feldwebel realized that we were not going to respond in the prescribed manner and repeated the call. Heil Hitler. Rang out our throats. Either I'm crazy, said Kellerman to himself, or he hopes that we will raise his morale. Sheish, said the prince. We have another speech to make. Another speech. This time it was the captain. I have the honor, he said, to take command of 2/3 of your regiment. Under my command you will go into battle. We understood what we were going to do, but we kept silent. The entire division will fight in the northern area. It will be divided into several areas in order to provide widespread resistance to the Russians, who have concentrated in the sector of large forces. I expect from you the highest heroism. We can't do without it. This is where we must stop the Russians. No one will be allowed to waver or neglect their duties. 3 officers at any moment can form a court-martial and mete out any punishment. Poor Frosch. How many officers have decided on your execution? We'll either be victorious or disgraced. No Bolshevik should ever set foot on German soil. And now, friends, I have good news for you. You'll get mail, and some of you will be promoted. But before you rejoice, you'll get new rations and uniforms from the depot. At ease. Heil Hitler. We went our separate ways. My mind was a mess. Everything seems to be going well, I said. The bastard. He'll be happy to watch us get killed, hissed Gels. We lined up in front of the big hut. That's who we got to replace Vesredo. I have a feeling we have a lot more to be surprised about, Prince. Oh, don't be. We've heard enough nonsense already. He's one of the fanatics, said Gals. Not at all. He's right, said Wiener. We turned around in amazement. He's right. Either here or nowhere. I can't explain why, but he's right. We stared at Wiener with uncomprehending eyes. How his eyes had changed. I'll tell you later, Wiener said. It won't get through to you now anyway. Paula. I am writing to you and looking at the letter I have been waiting for so long. As I read the lines you have written, I forget the Eastern Front, which still holds so many dangers. I hold your letter in my hands. It's a miracle that came down from heaven. I need a simple word. Simple words are what we lack. I read your letter and our comrade Smelens, who is lucky enough to believe in God, prays. But nothing can help us now, Paula. Prayer is like vodka. They only dull the pain. We don't even know what happiness is anymore. We're happy when it's daytime. Because darkness makes us think of death. I've been promoted to the rank of Oberfleur. Although the epaulets are still in my pocket, I already feel like an important man. All the horrible things we've been through have turned us into men. There's a roar coming from the east. Maybe it's just the wind. I look forward to your new letter. For several days in a row we fought battles as we continued our retreat. We were led to believe that the Bolsheviks would never set foot on German soil. But in 5 or 6 places the powerful armies of the Soviets had already crossed the German border and penetrated to a depth of about 50 kilometers. The three armies had crumpled the German soldiers who were defending the country. The survivors dragged behind them remnants of armaments by which alone one could realize that they were still fighting. Unfortunately, I am unable to describe in detail the confusion that prevailed at this time. I can only tell you about the deaths of my friends Prince, Spelowski, Zolma, and also Lenson, because in spite of everything, he was a true friend. I want to pay my last tribute to Lenson, to tell about his death, which still stands before me now. Whatever Lenson may say about me at times, I am sure that for all of us, for his homeland, he was a true soldier, ready to sacrifice his life without a second thought, so that any of his fellow soldiers could have an easier time. The way he died serves as an extra confirmation of these words. Perhaps it is because of him that I sit here now and write these lines. Lenson would never have endured the defeats that came to the troops of the Eastern Front. They were impossible to avoid, as well as cancel the order in the name of which he died. Those who have only one thought in their heads can only live for it. Beyond that, they have nothing but memories. Our attempt to save the Kurland front ended in failure. The Soviet armies reached the Baltic Sea in several places. The northern front was split into two parts near the Gulf of Riga and Liepāja, and west of Liepāja, in Prussia and Lithuania. The division was divided into several detachments, the purpose of which was to break the enemy by undertaking a simultaneous offensive in several points. For the most part, it ended in failure. From the offensive, we were forced to go on the defense. At this time, the division was trying to regroup in order to create a defensive front 60 kilometers to the northwest. Bad roads, fuel shortages, mud, and bad communications slowed down an operation that under other conditions would have taken us almost no time at all. To top it all off, we suffered from enemy aviation. After each night raid, disorder reigned in our weakened ranks. Having received orders to retreat, the officers decided to divide us into small formations, so that we would not be a convenient target for airplanes. However, if such tiny units were attacked by an enemy armoured platoon, there was little chance of survival. Under the circumstances described above, an incident occurred, after which we were almost written off as dead. We were in a village that was nothing special, just a few huts.